Some residents in northern Syria have begun fleeing the military operation. Bernard Smith has more from Erbil.
It looks like the fears of the Kurdistan regional government here in Erbil are already being realised. As Al Jazeera understands, at least a couple of hundred cars have been seen heading towards the part of the Iraq border administered by the Kurdistan regional government, the KRG, as Syrian Kurds escape the assault by Turkish forces on positions that they hold, that the SDF, the Syrian Defence Force, holds in northeastern Syria. Already there are some 90,000 Syrian Kurds here in 9 refugee camps administered by the KRG. They are already full. And over the other side of the border we have Al-Hol camp, which already aid agencies were saying was a disastrous, very, very tense atmosphere with the risk of an ISIL resurgency from within that camp. And there are detention centres administered by the Syrian Kurds. If those guards minding those centres, guarding those centres, have to go and fight for Kurdish forces, there is a fear of a breakout from the detention centres and from the refugee camp, and a fear that those people could head towards the border here.
Earlier, we spoke to Tayyip Ibrahim. He says Turkey should focus on dialogue with the Syrian government to resolve the situation on the border.
The Syrian government is not so happy in what Syrian Democratic Forces are doing, and indeed they are enemies to the Syrian government, and we know that they are separatists and they want to make their own entity and to divide Syria. But the treatment of this situation, I mean Syrian Democratic Forces and other Kurdish troops which are in the eastern of Euphrates, not by occupying Syrian lands. It is by working with Syrian government to put an end to that. And I think Turkey can work via political means and by cooperation with Russia, with Syria, with Iran, and with others to end the situation. And this is, of course, a situation, a terrible situation in the eastern of Euphrates. And nobody in Damascus agrees Syrian Democratic Forces, but everybody is angry here. From the Turkish occupation and the Turkish aggression against Syrian territories, whether it was territorial aggression or whether it was by airstrikes. Russia is trying to make a kind of reconciliation between Syrian government and between Kurdish groups to the eastern of Euphrates to avoid any military escalation, and they want to reach any kind of political resolution. And at the same time, Russians are very much concerned to make the historic reconciliation between Syria and between Turkey, between President Tayyip Erdogan and between President Bashar al-Assad. And this should be reflected in a very, very positive and healthy situation in the atmosphere on the whole atmosphere of Middle East. And I think by a kind of this strategic reconciliation, if it will happen between President Assad and between President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, it will put an end to Turkish ambitions, but from Russian point of view and from Syrian government's point of view, that it is better to reach a resolution and settlement for all problems by political means, not by military ones. This is an issue, but another issue from the point from the Syrian government, I think the side of Syrian government, they consider, as I told you, they consider the Syrian Democratic Forces as enemies, and some Syrian high responsibilities described them as enemies and as traitors, and some people said we must go to the war with them. Why? Because they are killing Arabs, they are displacing Arabs from place to place, and they are burning Kurds and killing the cattle of farmers there, especially only for Arabs, and they are taking Arabs by force to fight to their side.
Let's speak to Güran Özkan. He's the People's Democratic Party representative to the United States. That's a pro-Kurdish opposition group in Turkey. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for speaking to us on the Al Jazeera NewsHour. Can I first get your official reaction as a party, as the HDP party, to the developments and the news that Turkey has begun its military operation into northeastern Syria?
Well, this is absolutely horrific at this stage, where we're already seeing footage coming in from the region where there has been relentless bombing along the whole border. Civilian neighborhoods have been hit, and we're already seeing very graphic videos coming in of even children being affected by the bombardment. And so I think the reaction right now and the feeling right now of all Kurds, of the more than 40 million Kurds spread across the region, is one of horror. That one, the Turkish government would do such a thing, and two, the international community will allow for something like this to happen.
Even though the Turkish government is keen to stress in a tweet, in fact, that Turkey is not fighting the Kurds. Turkey is fighting the PKK and ISIL, and it's saying the safe zone will protect our borders and ensure the safe return of refugees.
Well, there are several lies just in that statement in itself. Firstly, there are absolutely no ISIS fighters who are active along that border that they're attacking right now. Secondly, it is the Kurds they're attacking, because even in 2017, when the Kurdistan regional government held a referendum for Kurdish independence in Iraq, and this is by the KRG, who have absolutely nothing to do with the PKK, actually have political hostilities with the PKK, and yet the Turkish government was very hostile to that decision, very hostile to the referendum, and even threatened Iraqi Kurds with starvation if they went ahead with the referendum, which they subsequently did. So the rationalizations given by the Turkish government hold absolutely no water anymore. And thirdly, actually, the president here, the US president, is tasking Turkey with combating ISIS and taking over the anti-ISIS fight in Syria, and actually taking control of the ISIS prisoners. But how can a government be tasked with such a thing? A government that allowed ISIS to develop in the first place? According to American officials, Turkey was implicit in ISIS's development in its first years, allowing ISIS to roam freely through its borders with Syria.
But what does the SDF...
tasking the Turkish government with...
Right, apologies. Just for the sake of time, let me jump in there. What does the SDF do now? What are the options for the SDF on the ground? Because, as you know, it's being perceived that the US president has abandoned his Kurdish allies.
Well, throughout history, the Kurds have always defended themselves. And I think right now, the only option left for the SDF is to defend themselves and their families and their territories against this unilateral action by the Turkish army. And so I think, there aren't very many options left for the SDF. The SDF have already, their resources were already very thin. They succeeded in a very efficient battle against ISIS and defeated ISIS to defend themselves, but they also did this on behalf of humanity with very limited resources. And now they have over 70,000 both ISIS fighters and their families in camps that they have to guard, again with very limited resources. And on top of this now, they have to face the second biggest army in NATO. All at the same time. So I think the options left for the Syrian Democratic Forces are very limited. And
right.
The best thing I think the SDF can hope for right now is that the international community see what's going on and hold the Turkish government accountable for anything that happens to destabilize the region in general.
Right. Okay, we thank you very much, Güran Özkan, for speaking to us from Washington. Let's continue with this and bring in Joe Macron. He's a Middle East analyst and fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. He's joining us from Washington as well. Thanks for your time on the NewsHour. You've written that Trump's decision to withdraw from Syria is just another side effect of his mounting troubles at home and abroad. Can you explain that?
Yes, at some point it's a distraction from his domestic crisis, and it's the same way how he basically run away from his own responsibility. We saw it in how he did with dealing with Iran and how he's dealing with North Korea. He bypassed the establishment. He always repeats the same thing. He is an anti-establishment president. who doesn't believe in bureaucracy, who doesn't believe that any of his advisors are smarter than him. He doesn't believe in empowering his own emissaries around the world. Now, nobody takes seriously Secretary of State or the Pentagon. They all directly come to Trump to deal with him. He likes to put this aura around him that he's the most smarter president, the smartest leader, that everybody should come to him. He knows better than the others. So yes, part of what's happening in Syria is his retreat, his antitrust of the establishment, his demeanor at home, and his continuing crisis that he doesn't believe, he doesn't trust his own government.
And when it comes to what my previous guest was saying just a moment ago, that the international community needs to hold Turkey to account when it comes to this military operation that has now begun in northeastern Syria, is that a viewpoint that you agree with? Because certainly in the past, we've seen the international community very divided when it comes to the issue of Syria.
I mean, sadly, there's nothing called international community. We live in a very realist world now, the post-Cold War, so we don't have this protection of civilians, all those things, especially in Syria now. You have a game chess. Everybody wants to fill the U.S. vacuum if they leave. Turkey wants to have its own piece of pie of Syria. You have also Russia and Iran. So this is the whole game now. I don't see now, I think Turkey is a bit reluctant to intervene. They want the civilian to basically push back. And we don't know what's the agreement with the U.S., what's the limit of this incursion, what's the off-limit that Trump spoke about. And yes, it's not the first time the U.S. basically gave up on the Kurds. They did the same in the Iraqi referendum. If you remember, it was Barzani. So the Kurds, they should learn their lesson at this point, and they should decide if they should shift alliances or no.
Will they be shifting alliances?
I mean, US credibility around the world.
Right. How likely is it that we do see the Kurds shifting their alliances? Because we know that Moscow and Sergei Lavrov has offered to negotiate with the Kurds as well and the Syrian government.
They did last year. They negotiated with an agreement with the Syrian regime, but the Syrian regime refused to give them full autonomy. So they didn't go as far. And at that time, the Trump administration told them, you either deal with us or you deal with the Russian and Syrian regime. So they basically went back. So now I think everybody is waiting a signal. If the U.S. is really withdrawing just a few meters, 50 soldiers, or is fully leaving the U.S. And I think at that point, the Kurds will be ready to shift alliances, to make a deal with the Syrian regime, but it might be late because they already left the border areas. Now they are empty for Turkey to enter. So I think Erdogan is mostly waiting the Russian green light before going in. Since the US basically told them, we are out, we're not doing anything, Iranians are worried. And then the Russians will have to have a say in what will happen, because if the U.S. is leaving, it means all the dynamics change, and the Russia-Turkey clash might be coming in the coming months, because now the Syrian regime was relaxed, that the Kurds were next to him, they were mostly a neutral partner or neutral player.
Right.
If now the Syrian opposition is coming in, they might clash with the regime, and now we have a new whole dynamics that will change the political process. And this is worry basically Iran and Russia. So we're still not clear what will happen next.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. We thank you very much for the time being, Joe Macron, for speaking to us from Washington. Thank you.